I'd like to welcome everyone. This is Julia Miller from EPA's State Climate and Energy Program, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Tech Forum this month on state public utility commissions, an overview for energy and environment officials. I want to thank all of our speakers. We've got Miles Keogh from NARUC, Ann Berwick from Massachusetts, and then we've got three folks from Minnesota, Vince Chavez, Bill Sirks, and Frank Kolash. And they're going to talk. Miles is going to give an overview, and then we're going to hear the other folks give a little bit of information on what their states have been doing, working together between the air offices, energy offices, and PUCs. So thank you guys so much for taking the time to be with us today and for putting together your presentations, and we're really looking forward to it. This webinar is part of EPA's State Climate and Energy Program. And the program provides information and resources for state governments on how clean energy, which we define as energy efficiency, renewable energy, and combined heat and power, can help reduce greenhouse gases and criteria pollutants. And the program provides tools and resources for states, and we send out a weekly listserv, an email on policy developments, both on the state and federal levels with regards to clean energy and climate change, and we have a few other resources. And if you're interested in the program or you'd like to sign up, you can email me, and the address is miller.julia@epa.gov. We have materials online for today's call, and you can see that at the bottom of the agenda. There's a web link, and thanks for scrolling down. Online, there's the agenda, there are all the presentations from the webinar today, and there's also a background document, which is a really useful resource. It's about 6 pages long, and it explores and explains the responsibilities of state public utility commissions, and it goes into a little detail on their decision-making processes and how their decisions affect energy efficiency, renewable energy, and air quality. So you can go online afterwards if you'd like and download those if you haven't already. Next month's webinar is going to cover resources to help state governments communicate with the public on climate change. We haven't set a date for that yet, but we'll send a save the date out really soon, hopefully in the next week. And as the operator noted, everyone is muted right now, so we won't have background noise, but when we get to the Q&A, we'll go over again for the folks who just joined us. We'll go over how you can ask questions, either on the phone or through the actual webinar software. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Catherine Morris from the Keystone Center, and she can get us started.
Thanks, Julia. I think you covered just about all the important points. To get you familiar with how you can type in a question online, because you may want to start doing that while you're listening to Miles or our other speakers. You have basically a control bar for your webinar that's off to the right, which you can minimize and get out of the way if it's in your way in any way. But when you open it up, there is an option for questions, and all you need to do is click on those questions, click on the question box, and type a question in. It gets sent to the hosts, and we'll verbally raise that question on your behalf if you don't want to speak up. But we will give you some directions again if you want to just voice your own question. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get us started and introduce our first speaker, Miles Keogh. Miles is the director of NARUC, their Grants and Research Department. Most of you know that the NARUC is the staff to the commissions all across the country. It's the National Association of Regulatory Commissioners. And he has responsibility not only for the grants, but has done a lot of writing on topics that are of interest to the commissioners to give them the information they need in their decision-making, everything from decoupling to infrastructure protection, disaster response, energy efficiency policies, carbon capture and storage, just about anything you can think of that he apparently is an expert in. He also provides training and facilitation services to the commissioners. And before that, he worked for a commission. He worked for the Massachusetts Commission in the siting office. So he is perfect for giving you really the overview of how PUCs work, and he promises to be both informative and entertaining. So Miles, we'll let you take it over.
Thanks, Catherine. I think the word you're looking for is infotaining. I always strive for that. Okay, I have been, please show my screen. Let me just ask before I start going along. Everyone see my fantastic cover slide?
Yeah, we do.
Brilliant. All right, good. So I've promised Julia that I'll curb my usual wordiness. It's very unlike me, but in the next 12 minutes or so, I'm going to try and run through every single thing that every state public utility commission does in every state of the country, and also try not to lose my job when I do it. Catherine mentioned I run the grants and research shop here, and it's a great job trying to help commissions who are made up of commissioners and staff who are much smarter than I am get resources that help their decision making. We do a lot of rooting around and grunt work, but they're really the smart ones. Right now we have about 17 different projects. Catherine covered some of the things that we work on where we just try and dig up what the smart people are saying about different topics and fields. As it turns out, clean energy and demand-side management and demand-side resources turn up in about half our projects. And just the usual disclaimer, if I say anything that makes you angry or that you think is a bald-faced lie about the activities of commissions, that's entirely my fault. If I say anything that you think is brilliant, I almost certainly got it from Commissioner Gene Fox in New Jersey or Diane Grunick in California or somebody else who is great. Because of the diversity of commissions that are out there, I'm going to say a lot of stuff that's a little bit vague, but that should apply pretty fairly to all commissions, although there's a lot of variety among commissions. So what is a public utility commission? Those of y'all who are on the phone, you can put on your sleeping eye masks for the next 3 or 4 minutes. A public utility commission is a quasi-judicial panel, sets the rates, terms, and conditions for the provision of essential services in the regulated utility sectors. NARUC didn't used to stand for National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. It used to stand for Railroad and Utility Commissioners. So 110 years ago, commissioners were more focused on trains and granaries and things like that than they were on electric power and broadband access and things like that. Commissions vary in their structure across the country, how many commissioners there are, what their partisan representation is, what their fields of expertise are, how they get the gigs, et cetera. But across all of them, the fundamental emphasis is on creating an open and transparent and accountable system by which everybody's views get heard, everybody's input gets considered, and then whatever comes out in terms of the public interest gets its day from a hopefully pretty unbiased set of decision makers at the state. State public service commissions are only the only electric companies that they have jurisdiction over are the investor-owned utilities, and depending on whether it's a restructured or a vertically integrated state, that may include a company that has power plants, transmission lines, distribution service, and retail service, or it may just be distribution and retail, or it may just be transmission and distribution. The rules vary in different places. But all in all, the investor-owned utilities that are jurisdictional to state PUCs are about 3/4 of the customer's revenues and sales. So a lot of them. Folks ask me all the time, especially folks from other countries ask me all the time, what's the difference between what the states have jurisdiction over and what the feds have jurisdiction over? The federal counterpart that's often held up is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, at least on the electricity and gas side. In electricity, federal jurisdiction is over sale for resale transactions. State jurisdiction is over retail transaction and over facility siting and distribution issues. So that little picture there gives you a little bit of a a less wordy and more easy to follow explanation of what the difference between federal and state jurisdiction is. This is something that's evolving over time. One of the things that happened in the late 90s, I'm sure all y'all were aware, was we all got market fever, and several of the states decided to move forward with electricity restructuring. Sometimes that was accompanied with unbundling of the electric utility, which required the electric utilities to sell off their power plants. And consequently, in some states, the generation side of the portfolio is managed by, is overseen by a different crowd of regulators than the state regulators. This maps, I think, current as of April 2010. The guys in green are the ones where restructuring is going ahead full steam. The guys in yellow are the ones where they put the brakes on, and the guys in white are the folks who decided they wanted no truck with deregulation and restructuring. And we can have another conversation some other time when I'm more ready to risk my job about what a great idea, how good of an idea or how well it's worked out as far as those new market mechanisms. In addition, you'll be able to see that state jurisdiction over utilities follows state boundaries. The market boundary lines are in some areas confined to utility footprints, even sometimes within states. And in a lot of areas, the market footprint isn't confined to a state line. It's operated as part of a regional transmission organization. Those guys are FERC jurisdictional, but they're all advised and informed, and in some respects beholden to, and in some respects have some sort of role played by state commissions that get together in regional state committees. So this is the shape of the markets, and it's not the same shape as the shape of regulatory jurisdiction. So these are this is what a commission actually does. It does a few different things. It ensures reliable, affordable, and clean electricity, and it does that through a few different specific activities: planning the system, siting infrastructure and going through evaluation of alternatives, cost allocation and cost recovery, which is often done in the context of a rate case, and I call it other stuff, but there's a whole passel of other activities that commissions either are the lead on in some states, have a role in some states, or are important advisors to in some states. So we'll go through each of those. Ensuring that there's reliable service has a lot of things, a lot of components to it. One of the most important is ensuring that there is adequate resource availability for the amount of electricity you're going to need. The EIA has predicted that we'll see about a 30% increase in the requirement for electricity services between now and 2030. There may be some impact from the recession, but I think over the long term, 30% increase in electricity services requirement, which is not necessarily the same thing as 30% more electrons, but 30% more stuff you're trying to do with power. I think that's probably a pretty fair prediction. And commissions play a large role in ensuring that decisions that we make today and tomorrow, and the accumulation of today's and tomorrow's and tomorrow's and tomorrow's decisions over the next 30 years wind us up in a place where in 30 years we have an adequate amount of demand-side, delivery, and supply-side resources. So we've got standard setting as a piece of, oops, excuse me, one too fast. As a piece of reliability. The technical standards for reliability are set by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, but this resource adequacy piece is something that's done by states, ensuring that the utilities are meeting and complying with NERC standards is something that a lot of commissions, most commissions do. Safety and security is a big piece of regulatory oversight in terms of standards. And the way that commissions do this is they require their utilities to submit plans with regular updates. And if the utilities' plans are, in compliance with the various requirements in that state, then, good for you. And if they're not, then you get dinged. And in some states, there's even incentives for high achievement in terms of reliability, meeting higher marks than you'd expect. So we've covered reliable. The next thing that commissions care about is affordable. This is a map of how cheap power was in the United States circa 2000, early 2009. These are the retail rates for electricity, and setting rates is a big piece of what commissions do through rate cases, where utilities come in and they unpack everything that they predict will be their cost of service. They unpack everything that they think will serve as load in terms of demographic growth and the other things, and they build a model that basically suggests it'll cost us. We think we'll have this much load. We think we'll have these many customers. It'll cost us this much to meet that, plus a little bit of profit so that we stay in business and keep having investors. And that's our revenue requirement. You divide that by the number of customers you've got out there, and that's your rate. And that's in 10 seconds, I've demystified rates for you. One of the key things about that complicates that algorithm that makes it more mystifying is that your revenue requirement is a rapidly moving target. This is the difference in the estimated cost of new supply between 2003, 2004, and 2008. And actually, the numbers that I'm starting to see come back make 2010 look a little farther over to the right for just about everything than you're seeing for estimated prices for all those resources. So reliable, affordable, and then the four things that commissions do are planning, siting, cost recovery, and other stuff. So the first of these is planning. Commissions have several tools that they use to work with their utilities to plan the system, to work with other states to plan the system, to work with federal counterparts and power marketing agencies and all kinds of other folks in order to make sure that over the long term we're making long-term decisions that ensure resource adequacy, that assure low cost, reliable, and clean electricity services. This is a map of the states that use integrated resource planning. That's just one tool that enables commissions to work with their utilities and their transmission operators and other stakeholders to plan the system. There are other kinds of tools, things like portfolio management and capacity auctions and all kinds of other things that commissions are involved in. One of the exciting new things that's happening right now in transmission planning is that from a jurisdictional perspective, from a electrical machine perspective, the electricity system in the United States really is three big machines, one in the east, one in the west, and one in most of Texas. And to date, there hasn't been really unified transmission planning in any of those regions except in ERCOT in Texas. The West has done some ad hoc transmission planning that's coordinated among states, but the East has not, outside of the RTO jurisdictions, really looked at interconnection-wide planning. And as of this year, there are at least in the East and in the West starting up, and in Texas continuing, initiatives to accomplish interconnection-wide planning. And I can talk for 3 or 4 years at a time about the stuff going on in the East and the West. So if you have questions about that, maybe we can address that later on. But this is certainly something that's a new area of transmission planning on an interconnection-wide basis. There's also a little map that I left on there that is in the lower right corner that demonstrates something called a siting, a national interest electric transmission corridor that deals with siting. We're about to talk about siting, so so that's supposed to be sort of a segue. All commissions have some role in siting, even if it's indirect. Thanks for for your patience with my insane slides here. Commissions have some role in siting. In terms of generation, commissions have a responsibility to oversee siting proceedings where alternatives are evaluated and where environmental and cost and cumulative impact and other kinds of reviews are performed. In terms of transmission, states have siting authority over all transmission within a state and over interstate transmission within, the portion that's within their states, except for under certain conditions where there's been some changes since 2005 that give some backstop siting authority that doesn't fall to the states. We also site inside the city gates gas infrastructure, so not interstate gas infrastructure. That's mostly sited by FERC, but once it gets to a local distribution company take station, everything behind that out to the customer, those pieces of infrastructure are cited as part of commission proceedings for the most part. And then a number of demand-side programs are also managed by the states, and that's not exactly a citing proceeding, but it has a strong impact on facilities that are cited. There's also a strong local role in some states. For example, in Washington State, a lot of the citing authority is ceded to local jurisdiction. Citing proceedings are quasi-judicial proceedings. There's site visits, and then people, bring evidence from all sides. There's intervenings by stakeholders who also provide evidence and also receive evidence. There's evidentiary hearings, and then at the end of it, we throw a big party where the citing board or the commission or the citing authority in that state makes a decision and releases, some sort of decision on the citing of that facility. And then again, there's new coordination among states and new backstops interstate citing authority that has been handed to FERC within certain well-defined areas and under certain conditions that was done in the Energy Policy Act of 2005. And then this is a map of transmission citing authority by state, and as you can see, the PUC has some sort of piece of it somewhere. You'll notice Massachusetts is yellow. It's a multi-agency citing board. That's what I used to work for, is the multi-agency citing board up in Massachusetts. So don't get me started on citing. Cost recovery. One of probably the 800-pound gorilla of what regulatory commissions do is set the rates. The regulatory compact that exists, the agreement between utilities and the public, is that utilities will, provide this essential service, that it makes sense for this to be a monopoly provision of the service, that, we don't want to have 15 different companies all running electricity lines into my house. And so in order to ensure that this essential service as a monopoly is fair, non-exploitative, and also, fair to the shareholders and to the providers of the electricity, rates are set in a very open, transparent process. One of the things that setting rates does is it creates what Warren Buffett once described as electricity being a good business to be in, but not a great business to be in. So a rate case is often a little bit of a hard-fought argument between consumers and consumer advocates and others on one side who don't want to see the utilities make too much money, and the utilities who want to be lucrative to their shareholders and their credit ratings and other things, and who want to be in a great business. Ultimately, cost recovery and rate setting is a balance between providing the utilities with lots of certainty so that they can get mortgages at great low rates and give their bankers lots of sureness that they'll still be in business, and also creating a risk-based incentive for them to innovate and try different things and really hustle to give good customer service, really hustle to get a lot of juice out of the fruit they're squeezing there. And then the last thing that's sort of addressing the rate setting process is there is a large wave of energy efficiency moving back over towards states. It's being seen as a bigger and bigger resource, and it's changing the context of rate setting. I won't get into what decoupling is, but decoupling is a word that gets thrown around a lot, and it's a subtle but extremely important change in the mechanism for revenue collection after you set rates, and it's something that we're seeing a lot more states trying to figure out how to do with one utility or a few utilities or no utilities or lots of utilities. The last thing that commissions do is other stuff. Commissions have oversight over natural gas service by local distribution companies. In a lot of states they manage, in other states they have an important role in tracking, in other states they simply advise the renewable portfolio standards. They manage or advise or track or play some role in a lot of utility funded efficiency programs. They're involved in a number of climate and environmental related programs, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast, loading orders in California and some other places, and some other activities in other places. They oversee the utilities' contributions to public benefit funds. They also do things like emergency preparedness, critical infrastructure protection, worrying about interdependencies between different sectors of the economy, like between electricity and telecommunications, transportation and gas, et cetera. And finally, coordinating with other agencies is sort of bread and butter to most commissions. That's a map of RPS from the Desire database, a fancy map of system benefit funds and of climate policy by state, and those maps were meant to just illustrate some of the other stuff that we do. I'll wrap up with a really quick preview of some of the things that are changing commissions. Again, what commissions care about is reliable service, affordable service, and clean service. If affordable doesn't matter if the lights don't turn on reliably, and affordable doesn't matter if we end up frying the planet through a change in the climate, and clean doesn't matter if nobody can turn on reliable supply or nobody can afford to buy power. So these are sort of three areas that are in conflict, but also, or not conflict, they're in tension with one another as the chief priorities for commission decision making. And they're constantly changing. It's a very dynamic set of tensions. Climate is sort of the new game-changing question mark in this, and it is seen as a bit of a game changer. A lot of the things that you would do in order to decarbonize your electric supply cost a lot of money. The one thing that costs a lot of money up front but tends to pay you back is energy efficiency. Commissions have not really been built and geared entirely around ensuring reliable, affordable, cost recovery, et cetera, to deal with demand-side resources. They're disaggregated in terms of the decision makers who implement them, and it's just trickier. So it is the new emphasis on efficiency at commissions is a game changer for commissions in terms of thinking about how they do planning, siting, and cost recovery, as well as all the other stuff that they take on. And with that, I will close up and pass the mic over back to Catherine.
Thanks, Miles. You covered a lot of territory. Thanks. I, again, want to encourage you, if you have questions for Miles, to please type them in and send them my way, or I'll ask our operator just to remind you how to unmute your line and ask him directly.
At this time, I would like to remind everyone, in order to ask a question, simply press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. Again, that's star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. We'll pause for just one moment to compile the Q&A roster.
And while we're waiting for questions to come in, Miles, you it seemed like in your very end of your presentation where you were talking about all the other stuff, that seemed to be the area where there was most overlap with the type of clean energy policies that other agencies are going to have their finger in as well. Would you agree, or would you say that rate setting also has implications?
If I was from an agency that was an air quality agency or a state energy office, I would be tempted to focus on the other stuff. And the other stuff is extremely important, and then there is a lot of overlap, and the language that commissions speak in that arena is going to be a language that you guys already know all the vocabulary, and you'll be able to play ball with that game pretty quick. That said, the other areas, planning, siting, and rate setting, I think are areas that are maybe target-rich opportunities for participation by other state agencies and other stakeholders that yield really important results, or can yield almost invisible but extremely significant setbacks to some of the things that folks are interested in. For example, in a transmission siting case, if you've spent a lot of time and effort on your RPS, and let's say you've got a giant solar carve-out in your RPS, so you're forking out a lot of money in state in order to get your solar portfolio really strong in that state. And then in a transmission siting case, a transmission line is approved that leads out to coal resources that are then brought in by wire. That will undermine some of your efforts with your RPS by depressing the price of high carbon resources, by bringing in cheap resources by wire, and making it harder for you to do what you want to do with a higher priced but otherwise policy preferred resource like solar. So siting's an example. Rate setting's another example. If you think that the utility is gaming their numbers to disadvantage something that you think has a higher policy preference, or if there is over or under ambitious targets set for demand-side resources and the like. A lot of the places where those decisions get made is within a rate case. And because it's called a rate case instead of an energy efficiency approval decision-making process place, it's overlooked. And because the folks are talking, rate setting and using a different vocabulary, getting involved can be fairly intimidating. I think a lot of states have created institutional infrastructure that, force collaboration. We've got Ann Berwick talking in a second about Massachusetts, which is an excellent example of states coordinating their decision-making. Minnesota is another really good example of that. But in some states, there are more opportunities to intervene and to take part in the rate setting, the siting, and the planning. And that's where a lot of big decisions get made that really affect your policy outcomes and what you're trying to do.
And I just want to remind folks that everything that Miles just mentioned, we have this detailed in the background document for today's call, and that you can find on the website. It's on the agenda.
You have a question from the line of Ellen Petrell.
Hi, Miles.
Hi, Ellen.
So good job, and you did cover a lot, and you mentioned decoupling, and without going into that, I see decoupling as an example of the kind of change that we're probably going to need in how utilities get paid as we go forward, because the whole business is changing. So there is a lot of feet dragging, I think, in accepting those kinds of changes. What's your view of will those kind of changes start happening? Will it be slow? Will it continue to be slow? And decoupling is an example of that. But what's your view of how we go forward?
Luckily, I don't need a job come Monday, so I'm going to agree with your premise. No, I think one of the things that regulators do is they try to make really prudent decisions. A lot of folks come in with a lot of really great ideas that are going to save the world, and it's sort of the Commission's job to kind of put the brakes on things a little bit. And I wouldn't characterize it as feet dragging. I would probably characterize it as the exercising of wisdom and prudence in otherwise hotly considered issues. That said, I think commissions broadly are probably the first to say that a lot of the innovations that come into play in terms of RPS, in terms of efficiency programs, smart grid, where they work, a lot of times they work because a commission has said to a utility, guys, that's not good enough. You got to come back with something that really knocks our socks off with X or Y or Z. So a lot of states have done decoupling. A lot of states have tried decoupling, have tried a lot of other mechanisms to address incentives and disincentives to efficiency, to incentivize RPS, to move on RGGI, to move on climate policy and the like. And I'm not sure it's fair to characterize all of the changes as being resisted by commissions. In fact, I think in a lot of cases they're instigated by commissions. But I think the reason why they're instigated by some commissions, and the reason why where they're not instigated by commissions, where we're starting to see a lot of commissions do less, quote fingers, foot dragging, is because commissioners, they're in the business of ensuring affordable, reliable, and clean, and the world's changing, and they're looking down the barrel of a changing world and trying to grapple with how to stay ahead of that. I don't think everyone's going to be happy with the pace at which regulatory policy changes. I think there's going to be places where commissions get caught with their pants down, not ready for, caught unawares with, not ready for, game-changing things that come at them. I think it's almost impossible to predict all the changes that are coming. But I think, commissions are aware that they're changing, and they're just trying not to make multi-billion-dollar wrong decisions. They're trying to make multi-billion-dollar right decisions. I don't know if that answers your question or not, Ellen.
It touches a lot of parts of it. Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of movement in lots of areas like RPS and so forth. So, yeah, I guess they're dealing with it in lots of different ways. So,
but I got to say, where the foot dragging thing has come up before, I know I'm throwing a little tantrum here, but decoupling and RPS and all these other things, those were all effectively demanded by commissions.
Mm-hmm.
So, so let's not say that the commissions are the ones who are poo-pooing and chasing these things away. In fact, in some cases, in many cases, they're the guys who made it start.
Okay, well said.
I'm going to jump in here, and I know we may have some more questions. I certainly have several online that are asking more specific information about particular policies or of PUCs across the country, and I want to hold those until we get through our other two speakers. We should have enough time at the end. And let me go ahead and introduce Ann Berwick, our second speaker. Ann is the Undersecretary for Energy, and this is within the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. She is going to talk to us a little bit today about one of the topics we thought was important, which is how structure of these different agencies can help actually facilitate some of this collaboration between energy, PUC, and environmental agencies. In her job, she was a key participant in the development of the Massachusetts Green Communities Act. We actually have talked about that on past tech forums. And she works very closely with both the Department of Energy Resources and the Department of Public Utilities. And she's also the acting chair of the State Energy Facility Siting Board. So she knows pretty much what's going on in all these areas. She's been a consultant before joining the state, and she's also been the chief of the Environmental Protection Division in the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. So I'm going to ask Ann if we'll put up your slides, we have your slides up, and let you take it away from here.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. And you can just move to the next. Yeah, thanks a lot. So since I was enlisted to participate in this webinar, I've actually had a job change. Starting as of June 7th, I'm going to be the chairperson of the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities. So that maybe makes my participation in this webinar slightly more appropriate even than it was when I was first asked to participate. But let me deal with the structural issues that I've been tasked to address. So when the Patrick administration took over in January of 2007, legislation was passed creating the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. So for the first time, the energy agencies and the environmental agencies were brought together under one roof. And those agencies on the energy side include the Department of Energy Resources, DOER, which is the Energy Office, the Department of Public Utilities, which is where I'm about to head to chair the DPU, and then the Energy Facility Siting Board, the EFSB, which is within the DPU. And as was just mentioned, I've been chairing that for the last 3 years. So these energy agencies were moved from Consumer Affairs into what had been just the Environmental Secretariat, but now is the Energy and Environmental Secretariat. So all of the traditional environmental agencies, such as the Department of Environmental Protection, the Department of Conservation and Recreation, Fisheries, etc., those are now all in one secretariat with the energy agencies being DOER, the DPU, and the Siting Board. At the same time, the DPU was reorganized from 5 to 3 members without any designated specialties. So the prior 5-member board had designated specialties for each commissioner. For example, there was a telecom commissioner, a gas commissioner. Now there are 3 members, and no one has any designated specialty. And also telecom, by the same legislation, was taken out of the DPU. So unlike some public utility commissioners, we don't address telecom. We address electricity, gas, some water utilities, and also some transportation issues. At the same time, the Energy Facility Siting Board was reorganized, now chaired by the Secretary of the Executive Office, and I've been serving as his designee as chair of the Siting Board. And so sort of globally, the intention here was to bring the energy and environmental agencies into one home with the intention of stopping the silo-type thinking that is inevitable, frankly, even with some consolidation, but is a much greater problem when the energy and environmental agencies are not all in the same under one roof. We can move to the next slide. That reorganization all happened in January or thereabouts, early 2007. And a year and a half later, the legislature passed new, extremely progressive energy legislation, along with, by the way, 5 other bills. It was kind of a banner year for EOEEA in terms of energy legislation. The other bills included, but aren't limited to, an Oceans Act, which requires Massachusetts essentially to look at various areas of various offshore areas in terms of which areas are appropriate for various kinds of development, and also legislation called the Global Warming Solutions Act, which requires the state to get to 80% below approximately current levels of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and to set an interim target for greenhouse gas reductions for 2020 of between 10 and 25%, and we're in the process of setting that interim target. But I want to focus on one of those 6 pieces of legislation that were enacted in July of 2008, which is our sort of omnibus energy legislation, the Green Communities Act. So that legislation does a number of things. It facilitates the development of renewables. It also, and I'm going to come back to some of the details, it mandates all cost-effective energy efficiency in preference to conventional generation, and it has a whole bunch of other pieces. So the most important things to know about that legislation is what it does for renewables in terms of facilitating their development, what it does in terms of mandating energy efficiency, and then a bunch of other pieces. So now let me go back briefly. On the renewables front, the ways in which it facilitates, or among the ways in which it facilitates the development of renewables, is through more robust renewable portfolio standards, and that involves DOER in setting those standards. But they have to actually, or rather really more in implementing those standards than in setting them, because legislatively, by virtue of this legislation, the RPS obligation for retail suppliers goes up by 1% a year. There's also a requirement for long-term contracts for renewables. That is, utilities have to go out twice in a 3-year period for up to 3% of their load, and enter into long-term contracts with certain specified types of renewables. And okay, so it's more robust RPS, long-term contracts for renewables, utility ownership of renewables. Actually, not all renewables, only just solar. So Massachusetts is a restructured state. Utilities cannot own generation. but this bill allows them to own, or this legislation allows them to own up to 50 megawatts of solar PV. It's not a mandate, but it's permission for the utilities to own solar generation. And finally, the law has extremely innovative net metering provisions. And I could spend the whole time talking about those provisions. I won't, but just briefly, up to 2 megawatts of wind and solar generation can be net metered, so you can run the meter backwards. If you have 2 megawatts of solar at your installation, at your commercial, or for that matter, residential or industrial or municipal or other governmental installation, and get paid a favorable rate, the retail rate. And in fact, public facilities, municipal and other governmental facilities, can have wind or solar installations larger than 2 megawatts and still get paid the retail rate. So that's briefly an overview of what the legislation does on renewables. It also mandates all cost-effective energy efficiency in preference to conventional generation. So obviously, what constitutes cost-effective energy efficiency is a complex topic, and those guidelines are set by the DPU. But the bottom line here is that utilities have to spend money on energy efficiency that's cost-effective before they buy resources, supply resources of a conventional kind. So about a tripling or quadrupling of expenditures on energy efficiency over the next 3-year period. And then there are a number of other innovations, including a Green Communities program, whereby DOER puts a fair amount of money into grants and assistance to municipalities that satisfy certain criteria for becoming green communities. Smart meter pilot program, a very progressive building code which updates automatically when the International Energy Conservation Code is updated, so every 3 years. So that's the story with respect to how we restructured in 2007 and then the progressive energy legislation that was enacted by the state in mid-2008. Now for the structural stuff that I was billed as talking about. This is, it's, since I sort of have been living and breathing this the last 3 years, it kind of feels second nature to me, but when I started putting it down on paper, I realized how complicated it actually is. So first, on communications between the Executive Office, EEA, shorthand EEA, and the Department of Public Utilities. And then I'll move to, in the next slide, but let's stay on the current slide, communications between EEA and the EFSB. So remember, these are agencies, the DPU and the EFSB, that are within the Secretariat, but nonetheless, communications between the Secretariat and each of these agencies is closely regulated. And I don't have anything here on communications between EEA and DOER because that's not complicated. DOER is not an adjudicatory agency, and communications can be unlimited between EEA and DOER, the Energy Office. Okay, so the DPU, now talking about communications between EEA and the DPU. The DPU has both adjudicatory and regulatory functions. So in adjudications, the DPU is an absolutely independent agency, even with respect to EEA. So the prototypical adjudicatory function is the rate-making function. So when a company files a rate case, that's an adjudicatory case. It takes place on a record, and the DPU is an independent decision-making body. And among other things, this means that conversations between EEA and the DPU are prohibited ex parte contacts. So just like in a judicial proceeding, nobody can just go and talk to the judge and say, Judge, you heard this evidence, but you should ignore it because this witness isn't credible, right? That has to happen in a highly stylized way on a record. Same is true for adjudicatory proceedings before the DPU. Nobody talks to the DPU other than on the record. And so if EEA wants to say something to the DPU, it has to put it in as evidence, whether that is oral testimony or written materials, depending on the proceeding, but no calling. There's none of the secretary or me as undersecretary calling up the DPU chair, which is about to be me, or the current DPU chair, and saying, hey, you know, we know you've heard the evidence, but we think you should also think about X. There's none of that. Okay. And when EEA wants to actually weigh in an adjudicatory proceeding, for example, take a position in a rate case, it does so on the record through DOER. So DOER will put a witness on, for example, in the rate case, or through its lawyers cross-examine witnesses that are being put on in the rate case. With respect to regulations, that's a somewhat different matter. EEA has to sign off on the DPU regulations. So EEA can speak directly to the DPU without violating ex parte rules. There aren't ex parte rules in the regulatory as opposed to adjudicatory context. However, it's often the case that if EEA wants to weigh in on regulations, even though it can do that simply by saying to the DPU, hey, we're not signing these regulations unless they include X, Y, or Z, it actually speaks in writing through the DOER on the record to get its views on the record. So that covers communications between EEA and the DPU. And to summarize, the story is there: adjudicatory proceedings, independent agency, no ex parte communication, and EEA qualifies as an ex parte communicator, can't do it. Okay, now going to the issue of communications between EEA and the EFSB. This is a funny one, and we've been struggling with what is permitted and what is not permitted. The EFSB also has an adjudicatory function. So when somebody files a petition to cite whatever, a generating facility or a transmission line, that's an adjudicatory function. So staff of the EFSB will hold hearings on the record and then make a recommendation to the EFSB itself, to the board itself. However, EEA and DOER are both represented on the board. I'm a member of the board. I chair the board on behalf of the secretary. The DOER commissioner is a member, is represented on the board. Two DPU commissioners are on the board. The DEP commissioner is on the board. So obviously the perspective of all of those agencies is brought to bear in an adjudicatory proceeding of the in a proceeding of the EFSB, in an adjudicatory proceeding. I'm distinguishing again adjudicatory from regulatory because the EFSB also passes regulations. If EEA or DOER or for that matter DEP or any other state agency wanted to weigh in other than through its institutional membership, in other words, if it actually wanted to put in facts to introduce evidence, it would have to do that on the record. So although I sit on and chair the EFSB and therefore bring the institutional perspective of the EEA to the deliberations, I don't get to say, oh, and I think this generating facility is too close to the nearest, proposed to be too close to the nearest residence because it's, I think it's really 500 feet away when the evidence said it was 600 feet away. If I have some evidence that it's 500 feet away, that has to go on the record in the adjudicatory proceeding. The EFSB has recently struggled with the extent to which it can get information from other state agencies, such as DEP, which is also represented on the board, other than as record evidence. So, for example, the DEP commissioner is is a member of the EFSB. Actually, she has a designee who represents her. So again, he brings the perspective of the Department of, that designee brings the perspective of the Department of Environmental Protection, but we have decided that he cannot bring facts other than as record evidence to bear in the proceeding. If there's, if the DEP has a record if the DEP has information, for example, that came up in a permitting proceeding about the facility that is before the EFSB, then it has to give us that information on the record. The person who sits on the EFSB, the designee of the DEP commissioner, can't just say, and oh, by the way, I learned through my role in a permitting proceeding that this facility is really only 500 feet from the nearest residence, for example. A crucial difference between the deliberations of the DPU and the EFSB is that the DPU deliberates in public. It's not required to do so by statute, but its own regulations do require it to do so. So the three commissioners of the DPU, by statute, go off and make a decision deliberating in private, just the way, for example, a judicial panel deliberates in private. You wouldn't expect the Supreme Court to have to talk in public about how they're going to decide a case, so that, you know, on the bench, the justices hammer out their differences. That's not the way it works in a judicial proceeding. It's typically not the way it works in a judicatory proceeding either, but it's different by regulation for the EFSB. And I just want to leave you, I'm going to stop, I want to leave you with one example, very recent example last week, of the ways in which bringing the agencies into one roof can make a difference. Just last week in a transmission siting case involving, I think, about a 3-mile transmission line, the EFSB decided that the company constructing the line would have to retrofit all of the construction vehicles in accordance with DEP's retrofit protocols for non-road diesel vehicles. So all of the construction, all of the off-road construction vehicles that are used to construct this transmission line are going to have to use very protective air pollution equipment. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Ann. You covered a couple of the different topics we wanted to get to. One, not only the institutional structures that can help facilitate this, but the legislation that can actually direct and require agencies to work together and separate and define those roles. And then the last set of issues you talked about in terms of the legal constraints that might affect how you want to influence policies at the PUC or at the Commission. So I want to see if there are any verbal questions, and we can take maybe 1 or 2 verbal questions before we move on.
At this time, I would like to remind everyone, in order to ask a question, simply press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad.
One of the questions that came in online, which I can answer very quickly, is what does EFSB stand for? You mentioned it at the beginning. It's the Energy Facility Siting Board, which is within the DPU. So that might help clarify that.
There are no questions at this time.
Okay. Well, then let me, we'll come back to questions as they come in, and I'll introduce our next speaker, Frank Kolash. Frank is actually sitting in the room with 2 other speakers, Bill Sirks and Vince Chavez, and I think he's going to introduce them. But let me just let you know a little bit about Frank. He's been at the Minnesota the Pollution Control Agency, which for really since 1996. But more recently, in 2008, he became the manager of the Air Assessment and Environmental Data Management section there. And in that position, he really provides leadership to MPCA's air monitoring efforts, their risk assessment and risk modeling work, their air quality rulemakings, the regulatory portion, and also their environmental data management systems. He is going to tell you a little bit about how the different agencies work together, and they have a particularly interesting model for how to facilitate some of that collaboration between the agencies via some personnel decisions that they've made, and he'll explain. So Frank, I see you're ready to go.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. And here in the room with me is Vincent Chavez, and Vince is the Special Assistant to the Director of the Office of Energy Security here in Minnesota, and he has been an energy policy analyst with the Department of Commerce for 25 years. And he will start off the presentation giving an overview of our Office of Energy Security and the energy planning functions at the state of Minnesota. And then we also have Bill Sirks, and Bill Sirks is a co-located manager between the Pollution Control Agency and the Department of Commerce. And at the Pollution Control Agency, he is a manager in the Prevention and Assistance Division and responsible for coordinating energy and climate change related activities with the Department of Commerce's Office of Energy Security. So with that, we'll start off. Vince will lead off the presentation, then Bill will have a few slides in the middle, and then I will finish off with a specific project that we undertook in Minnesota.
Good afternoon. Once again, my name is Vince Chavez. I'm with the Minnesota Office of Energy Security. We have very productive interaction among agencies. It has been formulated over the years, and I believe that our products speak for themselves. I think this all came about from the highest levels, from the legislature, from the governor's office, down to the individual analysts and people that are doing program level work. And once again, since everybody's involved, there is that participation, but there's that commitment at an individual level. People are here wanting to do something, and I think we're doing that. As I said, our products speak for themselves, and as a product of our interactions, we have come up with very good products that are consistent with each other, which is very important when you're going to the legislature and providing numbers, that we use the EPA's analysts to come up with certain calculations and certain figures for the legislature. They help us in calculating those. So I think with what we've got going in Minnesota, we do have agencies able to talk to each other and provide input not only to the legislature, but very muchly impact the Public Utilities Commission decision-making process. How do I go back? I can skip one. I did a quick schematic of how my office, the Office of Energy Security, is organized. As I'll mention, especially when we get down to the planning and advocacy, we have a role in regulation. It is that role that provides us direct input into the Public Utilities Commission, that and at the energy facility planning level. We are not the decision makers. However, we are a party to all actions in front of the PUC. So once again, just an overview of our office. The director of the Office of Energy Security is William Glahn. He is also the State Reliability Administrator, which will become more obvious why that's important as we continue. We have three general program areas, would be energy assistance, which will be our federally funded LIHEAP program. We've got energy planning and advocacy, and we've got the state energy office. Our charge, our mission, is to promote adequate, reliable, low-cost, and environmentally sound energy for Minnesota. Now, if I can, I'd like to just dissect some of the different offices or different program areas. I'll start with the Director of the Office of Energy Security and the Reliability Administrator. The Director or the Administrator, who are the same people right about now, he just changes hats now and then. He's also the Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Commerce, where the Office of Energy Security is located. As the Reliability Administrator, we use staff from all different areas. We carry out certain duties that would include managing all the mandated legislative studies, and there are quite a few. And the director's counterpart at EPA is a deputy commissioner, so that's at the highest level. And so when we start talking about the legislative studies, it's hands-on for these two high-level officials. And then the work filters down and we come up with a joint report. We're also, as the reliability administrator, responsible for participating at the federal, regional, and state forums for reliability-related issues. This would include some of our staff working with MISO, the Midwest Independent System Operator, and the activities that they are participating in. I guess that's the cost allocation right now is the hot topic. And then part of the reliability administrator is to facilitate long-range planning for future technologies. So with that, to the State Energy Office. Right now, our State Energy Office is also the conduit for the federal stimulus fund, so they're quite busy and they've reorganized slightly in there. But we have several program areas underneath that. Under the operations area, we have energy efficient buildings, wind, solar, and biomass, resources, and also the state grant and rebate program. We have, under that same program, the weatherization, which is a standalone program that is highly touted right about now. We were able to organize early on. The area under SIP is perhaps one of the important areas right now that we are working on as a state. And what's important about this, and where the PCA and Commerce actually get together, is there's a report due to the legislature that we're supposed to provide our MCF savings, which was about 875 million kilowatts and 4 million MCF saved, as well as our CO2 savings, which we've estimated as being over 1 million tons. That CO2 estimate is a collaborative between our SIP personnel and Frank's planners over here. Under energy regulation, we, as I mentioned earlier, we're a split commission in Minnesota. The Office of Energy Security contains the analysts that provide expert witness testimony. They do special reports for the commission. They will be doing, we also enforce the commission rules and orders. So there's two program areas underneath that. The first would be the regulatory regulation and planning. And as I mentioned, we're advocates for the public interests in all energy forums, state and federal, regarding energy regulation, planning, and policy. We're also advocates for actions and policies promoting reliable, energy sensitive, or environmentally sensitive, reasonably priced energy service. And yes, we took a role in the proceedings on decoupling here recently, where we've got a pilot program that's been initiated. Under energy regulation, we also have facilities planning, and I think this was mentioned by other folks as a role that the Commission has. We've have the same role on this side as we do in energy regulation. We are advisors to the Commission, and we, along with facilitating a review of all the facilities that are being cited, we're responsible for the public hearings and preparing the documents, which include the environmental documents. And so there's participation, once again, on that level for preparation and input from the EPA, and it just with permit compliance. So I failed to mention that at the regulatory level, that we are involved in several different activities. Well, let me get to that as we go on. Next slide.
We're only shortly into your presentation and have about five or at most 7 minutes left. So just wanted to give you a heads up.
Okay, well, it just quickly, there are several joint reports that we put together, and they've been collaborative efforts. We can provide websites to any of these, but it shows you that we have been working on reports continuously for the last 3 years. Back one. Under the environmental or energy planning and advocacy, we do been working together on routing permits, wind being one, and certificates of need, wind being a big issue up here, emissions recovery, carbon regulation, which is establishing a reasonable range of carbon costs, and that feeds directly into our integrated resource planning. So the role that PCA plays in our work products is essential. I think I'll leave it at that and hand it over to Bill Sertz, Mr. Sertz.
Good afternoon. I'll be very quick. I just wanted to talk about some of the voluntary areas of cooperation we've had. These are all not mandated by the legislature or the executive branch. They're results of just the initiative of the agencies. Probably the most effective or highest level one we have is there are 10 different state agencies that meet every 2 weeks to discuss specifically focused on energy and environmental issues. They range from our natural resources, agriculture departments, both of our agencies, our Department of Economic Development, Labor and Industry, Transportation, Health, Housing, and then our Metropolitan Area Planning Commission. So it's a great example of an ability to get very high level. These are either deputy commissioner or assistant commissioner, so really reporting directly to our agency heads, people who attend. And they're able to collaborate on high-level statewide issues affecting energy and environment. So some of those reports that Vince mentions, even though one of our agencies is responsible for those, we can get input from a whole range of other agencies on a comprehensive view, for example, of the status of greenhouse gas reduction efforts by all the different agencies. There's my position personally, I think Frank mentioned at the beginning, I'm actually co-located between the energy and environment offices, which is a really much more effective way than we realized initially, way of finding out and establishing personal connections. It's much more effective than just having periodic meetings as far as an understanding of how the two agencies operate and how to collaborate. And then I'll get into a few examples of the staff level coordination. In addition to having joint meetings of our energy and environment agency staff, we coordinated on a whole range of outreach actions, reports, as Vince mentioned a couple examples of those already. We have different sectors we try to reach, and I'll kind of shorten these. If anybody wants specific examples of programs, we'd be happy to give you, we'll talk with you further, but we connect at the local government level through joint programs that both agencies staff. At school sector, we're really focused on saving energy and carbon and have some collaborative programs where we have jointly requested funding and received that to deliver assistance. And that's basically about it. And everything from exhibits at the State Fair. We have an entire building that we focus on environmental and energy issues that our staff collaborates on closely. And definitely as we try to implement resource assistance and outreach to cities, schools, counties, we work very closely together basically at all levels. And with that, Frank, I'll let you go from there.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Bill. Again, my name is Frank Kolash. I'm with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, the environmental quality agency in Minnesota. And what I want to go through first on this slide is to identify some of the major statutory requirements that have been given to the Pollution Control Agency relative to proceedings that happened before the Public Utilities Commission. And it started in 2001 with the emissions reduction rider, which allowed utilities to make proposals to reduce environmental pollution and seek recovery of those costs outside of a general rate case. And it required the Pollution Control Agency to determine whether or not the proposal qualified under the statute, assess the benefits of the proposal, and then make a recommendation to the PUC on those proposals. That was followed up in 2006 with a similar type of statute, but focused on seeking reductions in mercury from utilities, requiring a 90% reduction in mercury emissions from utilities. Again, allowed for rate recovery outside of a general rate case. Similar types of responsibilities for the Pollution Control Agency to conduct on the proposals. They also included in 2006 the ability within one of these mercury proposals to address other air pollutants and seek rate recovery for those, and we have certain responsibilities within that statute. We also have responsibilities in the greenhouse gas emission control, and the first bullet really relates to the process that was known as the Minnesota Climate Change Advisory Group, which established a process and recommendations for seeking greenhouse gas reductions in Minnesota, and then the ongoing responsibilities to work with the Department of Commerce on tracking greenhouse gas emissions in the state and coming up with policy recommendations for the legislature to consider for greenhouse gas reductions in the state. We also have a number of statutes where we provide assistance to the Office of Energy Security or to the Department of Commerce, but we're not specifically identified in the statute required to do that work, but the relationship and trust we've built allows us to do that work. And those, I think, Vincent mentioned most of those, the renewable energy credits, we have a role to play in determining whether or not co-firing or fuel blending is eligible for renewable energy credits. We also, as Vince mentioned, both the cost of carbon resource planning and conservation improvement plans. And since the emissions reduction rate rider statute was really the first place where the Pollution Control Agency was involved in a major way with the Public Utilities Commissions, I want to go through that project in specific over a few slides. The emissions reduction rider statute and the Metropolitan Emissions Reduction Plan, the MERP, neither of those would have occurred without the involvement and the support of the governor, who made this a major component of his energy policy priorities, and also the groups listed here, including environmental groups, business groups, individual companies, and also key leadership at the Department of Commerce and at the Pollution Control Agency, and especially at the Department of Commerce, people who understood both the energy planning side and the environmental regulation side. A quick rundown of some of the drivers for the Metropolitan Emission Reduction Plan was to reduce fine particulates and their precursors. That affects also the regional haze for the Class 1 areas in Minnesota, reduce the emissions of coarse particles, reduce the emissions of NOx, which is a precursor for the formation of ozone, reduce mercury emissions, reduce lead emissions, address greenhouse gases, acid rain emissions, and also localized impacts such as traffic and coal dust, and especially focusing on seeking reductions from power plants that were grandfathered in under the Clean Air Act and did not have requirements for modern pollution control equipment on those facilities. And this graph just quickly shows the difference. The graph shows emission rates in a pound per kilowatt hour for one plant in the what is a lavender color up there, which was covered by the Clean Air Act, not grandfathered in, and then the emission rates for 3 power plants that were grandfathered in under the Clean Air Act and did not have to have modern pollution control technologies installed. So the statute specifically required the Pollution Control Agency to review the technical merits of the emissions reduction proposal, to do a capital cost review, do an assessment of the human health and environmental benefits, including cost benefits, and then provide a recommendation to the Public Utilities Commission on the actual project. And for one of the larger components of the Metropolitan Emissions Reduction Plan, the PCA found that the Xcel Energy's MERP proposal would achieve significantly lower levels of harmful emissions, even as it added 383 megawatts of new capacity to Xcel's system and fully refurbished to new quality 1,100 megawatts of capacity. So the keys to success of the MERP and also the emissions reduction rider was a very good roadmap established within the legislation that established roles and also put on par both the energy system benefits and the environmental benefits that would be received by some of these projects. And it also set up a system in collaboration between the Department of Commerce, the Office of Energy Security, the Public Utilities Commission, and the Pollution Control Agency, which has paid off dividends throughout the decade as far as the level of trust and the comfortability of working with each other that was built through the MERP project. And then just to show the results of the project, these are the emissions and tons of coal used. There was one facility that was part of the Metropolitan Emissions Reduction Plan, our King plant. What you see is in 2007, 2008, but especially 2008, showing how the tons of coal returned to, which is the middle gray bar, returned to full capacity, full usage, but the emissions of nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxides reduced significantly compared to 2003, 2004. And the coal usage you see in 2006, 2007 dropping, as that was the time in which the control technologies were being installed, so the power plant wasn't used at full capacity. And then this picture is just a lasting image of one of the major results of the MERP project, and that is the removal of the smokestack from our High Bridge plant, which is right along the Mississippi River. And so now that behind that is the natural gas, I believe that's the natural gas power plant behind that, and we no longer have a 500-foot plus stack sitting on the Mississippi River. And with that, we're open for questions.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. That was impressive results from that program. I wondered if we have any questions coming in from the operator.
Again, if you would like to ask a question, simply press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad.
And again, while we wait, Bill, about how much time do you spend at each of the agencies that you're involved in?
I have to 50-50 split, basically. So it's, and usually the way it works, I do either half a day at one agency and then half a day at the other.
And that works pretty well, huh?
It really, yeah, it does. And it's not so much the length of time, but it's the getting into specific work of the other agency, where if you're around, you can really start. I've been helping out on projects more than just like being there and trying to have things sink in, because just being there physically without actually getting into the ability to do some of the other agencies' work, when you are involved in either a joint project or helping out in one of theirs, you can really perceive areas of collaboration and opportunity a lot more effectively, I think.
Do we have any questions on the phone?
No, ma'am. There are no questions at this time.
Okay. Well, we had a couple of questions coming in online for some of our earlier speakers as well. One of them was asking, I think this might be an area that some of the agencies might be interested in, is the demand forecasting that utilities do and that the PUCs oversee. The question was whether or not the demand forecasting is public information that would be accessible to other agencies.
Catherine, this is Miles. You want me to take a swipe at that?
Yeah, it actually came in while you were talking, Miles.
Of course. It depends, and it also depends on what data you're trying to get into. In states that do resource planning, for the most part, the demand forecast is done, the inputs to the demand forecast are done through some sort of collaborative process. And a really good example of one is the forecasting that's done by the Northwest Planning Conservation Council, the PCC, and which is a group that does power planning for Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana together. So sometimes the inputs that go into the forecast are actually, not only are they public, they're a function of a public process. Sometimes the process by which the inputs are derived are much less public, and in fact some of the inputs that are put into a model in a lot of cases are business confidential information and are not necessarily public. The demand forecasts themselves in an IRP are usually very public, and in a rate case, for example, they're meant to be wide open. But sometimes you want to know the inputs that were used in order to derive the piece that you're being told about, and the inputs are not always totally transparent, although often they are. So that's really where the point of contention is about the transparency of demand forecasting is, what did you use to come up with your demand forecast, rather than, thanks for telling me very transparently what your demand forecast is. It's not exactly an answer to the question, but it's sort of.
Well, thank you. Thanks for trying. And another, if I could jump back to our Minnesota speakers, another question was, what are the plans in terms of new projects where particularly the Pollution Control Agency might have some impact over decisions at the PUC?
This is Vincent Chavez. We've got a couple different things happening. I guess one that's notable, and we finished our legislative session, thank goodness. But there's a large solar demonstration project going in or being planned for the Rochester, so the southeast quadrant of the state. The PCA is trying to use full landfills for renewable energy. And what the plan is to put a large solar demonstration project on one of these landfills. What becomes even more interesting is that the legislature on a one-time basis is going to allow the purchase of solar energy from that project, and only that project, to be counted towards the conservation improvement or energy efficiency savings goal. So this is one of those situations where everybody is working together, including the utilities, the regulatory bodies, and the PCA, and trying to move forward on an innovative large solar project.
And this is Frank from Minnesota. We also have a continuation of some of the mercury reduction plans that are coming in from the facilities. They had a longer timeline for mercury reductions, and in the most recent legislative session, there was an extension given to one facility to turn those in. And we're right now working on reviewing another proposal from Xcel Energy to deal with, I think, their mercury reductions also. So it continues on, especially with the focus on the mercury reduction. And to Vince's point, just to emphasize that in Minnesota, the legislature chose for old landfills that the state would take ownership and maintenance of those. So we have 106 sites throughout the state where the state is the owner-operator of a closed landfill. We lined them, we maintain them to the highest standards, and now we're looking to install renewable energy projects on those lands. And so that's where it becomes something that the PCA is very involved with, as far as using some of these lands managed essentially by the state for solar generation or other renewable energy generation.
Thank you very much. I know we're a little bit over time, but I have one more question I'd like Ann to try to answer if she could. That was very interesting. People were, one of our audience members was asking whether or not you have any insights on the politics that really enabled the type of structure you have in Massachusetts, the enabling legislation that created your office and the oversight.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I always am a little nervous about opining on politics, on which I don't really consider myself to be an expert. But you know, I think it was the start of a new administration gave an opportunity to do something different, I think, and I think it was clear to the Patrick administration from the get-go that it simply made sense to combine the energy and environmental functions. During the campaign for the governor, Governor Patrick had combined his energy and environment advisory teams. And that just seemed like falling off a log. It just seemed like so many of the issues were related that it made sense. And then as a continuation of that, it made sense for him to propose to the legislature that the energy and environment agencies be brought into one home. And I think the legislature, you know, I guess it just made sense, not to say that politics is always a respecter of what makes sense, but it just seemed, I think, to everybody to work, and I'm certain that no one wants to go backwards on that.
Well, great. Thank you very much. I want to thank all of our speakers, and I apologize to those of you who did send in some questions we didn't get to. There's a great one here, Miles, for you on feed-in tariffs if you really want to lose your job. So we'll try to forward these, and if they have time, I'm not going to make any promises on their behalf, but if they do have time, maybe they can shoot you back an answer via email. And of course, they did share with you their contact information if you want to follow up directly with them. So with that, we are going to close this Tech Forum call and invite you back to look for some information about the scheduling for next month's call. Thanks very much, everybody, and talk to you next month.